Meeting with UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, he then took questions on Iraq and the Middle East peace plan. This is about an hour.
Statement, the Prime Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, sir, I should like to make a statement on my visit to the United States from the 15th to the 16th of April. In New York, I met the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and in Washington, President Bush. With them both, the two main points of discussion were Iraq and the Middle East peace process. On the issue of Iraq, first of all, there is no doubt the present situation is very difficult. Since mid-March, the United States have suffered 123 military fatalities, of which 112 were killed in hostile action. One Ukrainian soldier was also killed in Al-Qud during recent disturbances. A number of contractors have been targeted since the middle of March, in addition to a number of the US civilians killed. One British, one Italian, and one Canadian security guard, 2 Finnish businessmen, 3 German citizens, and 1 Dutch contractor have been killed. Most security incidents continue to occur in the so-called Sunni Triangle, northwest of Baghdad. This includes the town of Fallujah, where the US Marines have set up a cordon against Sunni insurgents. US forces are also deployed around Najaf, where Muqtada al-Sadd's supporters are still ensconced. There is currently a pause in military activity in Fallujah and Najaf to allow discussion with those involved. I hope the whole House will join with me in passing on our deepest sympathy to the families of all those who have died, including the civilians, Iraqi and Western citizens. And we should not lose sight of what is actually happening across the majority of the country. 2,300 schools have been rehabilitated, $32 billion has been pledged for reconstruction. Electricity generation is above pre-conflict levels now. Higher oil production over the last 4 months has given Iraq $2 billion more in revenues than we expected even last November, and the Iraqis are enjoying the benefits of a new Iraqi currency worth 40% more than the discredited Saddam dinar. Of course, there will be resistance, as we are seeing in Fallujah and Najaf. It is, I suggest, absolutely clear what is going on there. All those who think they will lose out when Iraq becomes democratic, former Saddam supporters, foreign terrorists, militias led by extremist clerics, all of these have a vested interest in seeking to delay or disrupt the transition towards democracy. They portray themselves as opponents of American occupation. In fact, they are opponents of allowing the Iraqi people the chance to choose their own leaders in free and fair elections. It is essential that the forces of reaction and terror do not prevail. The vast majority of Iraqis want a prosperous, stable, democratic Iraq, at peace with its neighbours, a force for good in the region and the world, with international forces staying not a day longer than they have to, Iraq's wealth, Iraqi wealth, Iraq's oil, Iraqi oil, a country that is a sovereign, independent state governed by Iraqis for the benefit of Iraqi citizens. That is exactly what the coalition want. We are on their side against the small minority of those trying to disrupt this vision. We have a political and military strategy to achieve it. Our work on reconstruction and investment in Iraq must continue so that all parts of Iraq know that they have a place and a future in the new Iraq. We will redouble our efforts to build the necessary capability of the Iraqis themselves to take increased responsibility for security and law and order. We will hold absolutely to the 30th of June timetable for the handover of sovereignty. We will work with the UN Secretary General's representative, Mr. Brahimi, and all members of the UN Security Council to secure a new Security Council resolution to set out the new arrangements. The UN should have a central role, and this should be developed still further once the occupation ends on the 30th of June. The UN indeed will have a vital role in the electoral and constitutional processes in 2005 and in coordinating international reconstruction assistance. I welcome the proposals made by Mr. Brahimi for this transition. As he says, the most important milestone is the election to be held in January 2005. Before then, there will be an interim government from the 1st of July to be formed before the transition, led, as he has said, by a Prime Minister with the President to act as head of state and 2 Vice Presidents. I also welcome Mr. Brahimi's suggestion of a large national conference to promote dialogue, consensus building and reconciliation in Iraq, and to elect the Consultative Assembly to serve alongside the government in the period up to January 2005 and help prepare for elections. This is the vision. We will stay the course until it becomes the reality, and I hope that the whole international community will come together to support it. Whatever people's views of the wisdom of the war in Iraq, it must surely be in everyone's interest, not just in Iraq, but across the world, for this vision of hope and democracy in the future of Iraq to prevail and to succeed. Mr. Speaker, I also discussed the Middle East peace process with both Kofi Annan and President Bush. We condemn the targeted assassination of Hamas leader Abdulaziz Rantizi, just as we condemn all terrorism, including that perpetrated by Hamas. We have to break out of this vicious cycle of suicide bombings and retaliation. Israel needs security, and the only lasting security will come from the stability of a solution to the Middle East peace process with two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace. That is why we welcome the Israeli proposal to withdraw from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. The roadmap remains the best way to peace, and disengagement from occupied territory can be an opportunity to return to it. Disengagement is not the final step. It has to be an important first step on the road to a final settlement. There was criticism that last week's announcements prejudged the issues of Palestine's final status. It should not, and it does not. It is a statement of fact that those final status negotiations, when they come, cannot ignore the reality on the ground. But all issues, I repeat, are to be decided in that negotiation. Israeli withdrawal also provides a chance for full engagement by the international community. The Quartet should seize this opportunity to help the Palestinian Authority take the necessary economic, political and security measures so that a viable Palestinian state becomes not just a concept, but a real possibility. I hope a meeting can take place of the Quartet as soon as possible, and in any event not later than May, to discuss this issue. Mr. Speaker, among the other issues I discussed in both New York and Washington was Cyprus. I'm sure the whole House will join with me in paying tribute to Kofi Annan, both for the skill and distinction with which he has led the UN during difficult times, and specifically for the work that he has done on Cyprus. I hope the people of Cyprus will see the benefits of the United Nations plan and vote for it in the referendums on Saturday. Mr. Speaker, I believe passionately that all these issues need to be seen in their wider context, for they are all linked. We are firm in response to terrorism and states proliferating weapons of mass destruction. But we must also be firm in tackling the breeding grounds of terrorism. That means broadening out the international agenda and confronting the issues upon which the terrorists prey: poverty, conflict, religious and ethnic strife. Both the UN Secretary-General's high-level panel on the future of the UN and the G8, chaired this year by the United States and next year by the UK, can help establish this broad and common agenda and set a forward direction for the whole international community. It is more essential than ever that they do so.
May I begin, Mr. Speaker, by welcoming the fact that the Prime Minister decided at the last minute that he and not the Foreign Secretary would make this statement on these vitally important international issues. We welcome this small U-turn by the Prime Minister, just as we welcome his big U-turn to hold a referendum on the European Constitution. On the substance of his statement, I entirely agree with what he said about Cyprus. On Iraq, we do not in any sense resile from our support for military action against Saddam's regime. We fully support the continuing deployment of British troops in Iraq. We pay tribute to them for their competence, their professionalism, and their bravery in very difficult circumstances. And I join the Prime Minister in expressing our sympathy to the families of all those who have lost their lives in the circumstances which he described. I'm sure that the Prime Minister will want to join me in condemning the roadside bomb which last night injured 3 British soldiers in Al-Amara, particularly since 2 members of the same regiment were injured on Saturday. Notwithstanding the very great difficulties clearly present in Iraq today, I agree with the government that it is essential that we see this through, and like the Prime Minister, I reject the criticism of those who suggest we should now pull out. On the scale of the military commitment, can the Prime Minister tell the House whether British commanders in Iraq have asked for reinforcements and whether any such request has come from the Americans? What arrangements are being made to replace the 1,300-strong Spanish contingent, whom we are told are to be withdrawn as soon as possible? While the United Kingdom has been punching above its weight militarily, are there not concerns that we haven't been doing so diplomatically and politically? To make that point is not in any way to criticise David Richmond, as the Prime Minister falsely asserted on the radio on Saturday morning. I've no doubt that Mr. Richmond is an able man doing his best in difficult circumstances. I'm not criticising Mr. Richmond, I'm criticising the Prime Minister. Why has he refused to send to Baghdad a more senior and authoritative figure than Mr. Richmond? Did he raise in Washington last week the role of the British representative in Baghdad? Did he ask the President to designate the British representative as Ambassador Bremer's deputy? The Prime Minister will be aware that it has been widely reported that even Sir Jeremy Greenstock found it extremely difficult to make his voice heard at the headquarters of the Coalition Provisional Authority. Isn't that why, when British troops are in daily peril, that there should be a powerful and senior British voice in Baghdad giving us a real say in the decisions that are made? As we approach the 30th of June deadline for the transfer of sovereignty, I welcome the announcement that the United Nations will be involved in the handover. But what precisely will be the nature of that involvement? Will United Nations Special Envoy Brahimi have the same discretion and flexibility as he had in Afghanistan? Were he to come to the conclusion that the deadline of 30th of June is unrealistic, would that deadline be reconsidered? Given that the deadline is little more than 2 months away, can the Prime Minister answer these crucial questions? How will those to whom power is to be transferred on the 30th of June be selected? Will that be a matter for the United Nations or the Coalition Provisional Authority? What powers will be transferred? In particular, who will be responsible for security? Yesterday, Ambassador Bremer said it's clear that Iraqi forces will not be able on their own to deal with security threats by June the 30th when an Iraqi government assumes sovereignty. Will the new Iraqi authorities, after the 30th of June, be able to decide on the way in which coalition troops are to be deployed, where they are to be deployed, in what force they are to be deployed, or whether they're to be deployed at all? Will the Iraqi authorities have the power to ask coalition troops to leave Iraq? Will they have the right to decide what happens to any insurgents apprehended or captured by coalition forces? Great concerns have been expressed over the performance during recent events of the Iraqi security forces. Did the Prime Minister raise with the President the nature of the steps which should be taken to improve the training and effectiveness of those forces? Finally, on Iraq, doesn't everything that has happened over the last year reinforce the warnings that we gave at the time about the lack of a carefully thought-through plan for reconstruction in post-war Iraq? They're all on the record for the Prime Minister to see. On the Middle East process, was the Prime Minister consulted by President Bush before the President announced his endorsement of Prime Minister Sharon's plans last week? Did the Prime Minister express the view to the President that, given that the roadmap had been drawn up by the Quartet, it would have been more appropriate for the Quartet to be involved in further decisions of this kind, rather than for them to be decided bilaterally between the United States and Israel? While we welcome Israel's disengagement from Gaza and partial disengagement from the West Bank, does the Prime Minister agree that there will be no lasting peace or security in the Middle East without establishing a viable Palestinian state alongside a secure state of Israel? And will he confirm the following two principles. First, that a two-state solution cannot be imposed and must be reached by agreement through negotiation. Secondly, that all the elements of such an agreement, including the Palestinian right of return and Israeli West Bank settlements, must be on the table for negotiation. Will he confirm that last week's statement by President Bush must be the start of a process and not the end of it? And finally, given, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister is always eager to secure the maximum possible agreement within the European Union on these issues, can he confirm that if such agreement existed and the Constitution were in force, it would have been the President of Europe and not the British Prime Minister who would have been meeting the President of the United States last week?
Well, first of all on Iraq, I should thank him for his support, which, as ever, was generous. I can't say he's really, on the evidence today, someone you want to go tiger shooting with, is he? He gives us all the way through. What he tries to do is to give us general support and create as much particular mischief as he possibly can. And can I just say in that regard, although he says his criticism of the status of David Richman is not actually a criticism of David Richman, well, I don't think many people took it as anything else than that. And can I just say to him, there is nothing worse when these people are doing a difficult job on the ground, actually risking their lives for the leader of the opposition to score points by saying they're not the suitable people to do the job. Oh yes, that is exactly what he's doing, and everybody knows it. Now, as for the UN involvement, of course the UN involvement is there right up to and through the 30th of June deadline. The 30th of June deadline has already been reaffirmed by Mr. Brahimi, as well as the United States and Britain. In respect of the political process, the UN will carry on with the consultation and dialogue it's got at the moment, most notably, obviously, with the key groups in Iraq. What is interesting is that in all the negotiations that Mr. Brahimi has had, it is absolutely obvious that a majority of Iraqis, whether they are Kurds, whether they are Shia or Sunni, actually want a broad-based constitution that represents all different groups in Iraq. I happen to think that is a cause for optimism, even amongst the difficulty that we have at the present time. Now, in respect of the Iraqi forces, it has always been anticipated, always, that there would be a security agreement with the new Iraqi government after the 30th of June that would involve coalition troops. It has never been the case that we were able to, after the 30th of June, to turn all security issues over to the Iraqi forces. We are, however, making attempts, obviously, to make sure that the Iraqi capability to do both policing and civil defence work is extended and made as secure as possible. That is important. It is difficult for them. It is bound to be difficult in the circumstances where they are creating an entirely new police and civil defence force in Iraq, but I think that we will manage to do so. And it is interesting to note that at the present time, at least, although the difficulties in Fallujah and Najaf, let me emphasise to people, still exist and are very acute, but nonetheless there is the involvement now of local leaders and also of Iraqi police and defence forces. And I hope very much that we can resolve both of those issues in that way. It is, of course, essential that we improve the training of the forces. But my view overall on this is that, of course, these difficulties are there. In some ways, I think they are to be expected. I totally reject the line that somehow there was not a proper preparation. Of course, in circumstances where there has been, after the conflict, there has been and always was going to be a situation where certain groups within Iraq would try to dislodge the progress being made. Of course, it was always going to be the case that it was difficult. But in my view, these difficulties have got to be a reason for us redoubling our efforts, not a reason for us retiring and retreating from the field. Now, in respect of the Middle East, well, I think it is the case that actually, we wouldn't have quite gathered from what he said, that we're in agreement about the way forward on the Middle East. It is right, of course, that the final status negotiations must include all these issues, whatever the expressed views of either Israel or America. All I have been saying is that the fact that there is a disengagement by or a withdrawal by Israel from the Gaza and the West Bank at least gives us the chance, not just the Palestinian Authority, but the international community, to play a role in building what will be the necessary capability in economic, in political, in security terms within the Palestinian Authority, in that part that they will have control over once the Israelis withdraw from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. I don't in any sense minimise the anger at other things that were said or done over the past few days, but I think it's important that we focus at least on the possibilities that that disengagement offers. And in respect to the European Union, I have to say his position is absolute nonsense. There is nothing that would prevent us taking a view as an independent, sovereign country, and it will be a pleasure to debate the reality, not the myth.
Charles Kennedy.
Mr. Speaker, I certainly echo the very proper expressions of condolence, both to our own forces, to other countries' forces, and indeed now, increasingly, to those civilians from countries around the world who are there to assist in their own way, in a business, in a rebuilding sense, who have found themselves the focus of attack, as well as those innocent Iraqis who continue to lose their lives in significant numbers. And on the position of the British forces in particular, we certainly agree with the Prime Minister that given whatever differences have preceded the position we find ourselves in today, it is quite clear that the skill and the bravery and the sheer professionalism of our forces should continue to be deployed for the very ends that everybody would want to see: a stable and a secure Iraq, for its own sake, for its people's sake, and for the interests of that most difficult region in the world. Now, Mr. Speaker, the discussions with the President in particular, as we all know, took place against three very troubling backdrops. First, what many of us regarded as the excessive military force being used by the Americans in Fallujah in particular. Secondly, the continuing political uncertainty, both for the people who want to see the transition, as we do, and we agree that we should adhere to the June deadline, the people that want to have that signal reinforced, and it's welcome that it is, within Iraq. And thirdly, of course, being preceded, these discussions between the Prime Minister and the President, by another deeply concerning act of effective unilateralism by the Bush administration vis-à-vis the Prime Minister of Israel, and that calling into question many of the assumptions which this government, with all party support, have held dear and integral to this process over the roadmap and over indeed existing UN Security Council resolutions. The worry, Mr. Speaker, for many of us, watching the events of last week and listening to what the President was saying in his press conferences with the Prime Minister, is that there is no doubt the President gives the appearance of listening with great courtesy to the Prime Minister. The nagging doubt that many of us have on these issues is the extent to which the President, however, is actually choosing to hear what we hope the Prime Minister is trying to get over to him in the course of those talks. Now, it is undoubtedly welcome news, Mr. Speaker, that there is to be an increased role for the United Nations in Iraq. And the lack of legitimacy of the present situation stems from the effective sidelining of the UN during the conflict itself. But would the Prime Minister acknowledge, and perhaps he has made this point to the President, that the very dismissive terms in which many in and around the present American administration have spoken of publicly about the UN, and the warmer words which are now coming into play, will have to be matched by deeds if they're to carry the confidence of the international community? And when the Prime Minister says that the UN will be continuing its present dialogue, and that he is encouraged by the efforts of Mr. Brahimi, as indeed we must all be, is he satisfied that the Americans will give that level of input which is so crucially required? And second, on Iraq, Mr. Speaker, would the Prime Minister recognise that to class everybody, as the President and he have done, who are being driven into the hands of the terrorists and the fanatics, as he rightly describes them, as by definition being terrorists and fanatics themselves, when one sees what happened in Fallujah last week, the hundreds of innocent civilians, women and children, these people are not terrorists or fanatics, but when they see what is happening in their own domestic circumstances, the real tragedy is that some of the wilder elements get driven in the direction of the terrorists and the fanatics. And the Americans must surely understand that. On the wider Middle East peace process, Mr. Deputy Speaker, does the...
Order. The right honourable gentleman should be heard. It's unfair. It's unfair. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister this afternoon confirm the words of his Foreign Secretary of the last few days that this policy of Israeli targeted assassination is both unlawful and unjustified and is also counterproductive? And is the British government making direct representations to the Israelis to that effect? And secondly, the Prime Minister in his statement about the new position that has now been adopted by the Israelis and the Americans said that this is a first step. It's the beginning of a new phase of this process. But Mr. Sharon, both in the plane home to Israel and in what he's been saying since he got back to his own country, gives every indication not as seeing this as a first step, but as seeing this much more as a final step as far as he is concerned. And what will our position be then? And finally, Mr. Speaker, we have heard, and perhaps he could confirm for the House one way or the other, that the Americans, in the build-up to the original decision to mount the war in Iraq, gave him the option of not participating. Now, I asked him repeatedly at the time, were there circumstances that he could envisage under which this country would not participate in unilateral action with the Americans, but without UN sanction? He never answered that then. Can he at least tell us if that option was made explicitly open to him by the Americans at the time?
Just on the last point, I find it somewhat extraordinary. Of course, it's always the case. Of course, we got the option. Whether we participate or not, we had to take a decision. We actually took it finally in this House and decided that we would. And, you know, I've never made any secret of the fact I believe it was right that our troops were there. It's not it's not something that was exactly secret, I don't think. Now, in respect of this... in respect of the first two elements of the points he makes, in respect of the UK forces, I mean, first of all, let me welcome what he says, which I think is right and responsible, that whatever differences there are over the war, it's right that we continue to be deployed and see this through, because it must be in everyone's interest now to get Iraq resolved in the right way. I don't accept that we have ever wanted to sideline the UN. I mean, we made copious efforts to get the UN to back a final ultimatum to Saddam after we'd already got its backing in Resolution 1441 to demand that Saddam comply and comply fully with what the UN said. There have in fact been no fewer since 1441 than three other UN resolutions. And the President and I agree that we should seek a further resolution that puts all of the issues to do with the political and security measures in context and carry them through. I mean, I agree with them, incidentally. I have not said that everybody who is, as it were, angry at whatever action is being taken is a terrorist and fanatic. But there's no doubt in Fallujah, the people driving this are terrorists and fanatics. I agree with them, however. It's important we make sure that they are not able to draw in other people to them. Now, what arose in Fallujah arose out of the brutal murder of those civilian contractors in a particularly horrific way. But I hope now, with what is happening in Fallujah, with the engagement of local leaders, with the talks taking place between those local leaders and the Americans and other leaders from the Iraqi Governing Council, it is possible to resolve this situation peacefully. I hope it is. But let's be quite clear. It is also necessary to say definitively, because this is going to be important for the new Iraq that we want to create, that you cannot have a situation where either outside terrorists or clerics with their own militias or gangs of insurgents heavily armed try to run the country. I mean, that is what has been the tragedy of Iraq over many, many decades. I mean, it is surely right that we say to all of those people, if you have a particular point of view, you go and stand in the election. You do not end up trying to get your way by violence when you're unable to gain it democratically. In respect to the Middle East peace process, I do, of course, confirm what the Foreign Secretary said over the past few days about targeted assassinations. What I think it is necessary to do, however, and this brings me to the point about whether Mr. Sharon sees this as a first step or a final step. Mr. Sharon actually, in the course of his press conference, also reaffirmed his support for the roadmap. Now, I would simply say this. I understand the anger about statements made about the right of return or of refugees or settlements and so on. But there is still, despite that, an opportunity. And in the conversations I had with European leaders over the weekend, I think that people recognise this, which is why the European Union statement actually welcomed the disengagement from the Gaza and parts of the West Bank. Of course it should not be a final step. Of course it is not a final settlement. My point very simply is this, that it must be better than what we have now to have at least some disengagement from the occupied territory, provided that disengagement is followed by active measures supported by the international community to give the Palestinians the economic and the security and the political strength they need so that this idea of a Palestinian state that is viable becomes a realistic possibility.
Colonel Kaufman.
Mr. Speaker, will my Right Honourable reconfirm in specific terms that the policy of Her Majesty's government, in accordance with United Nations Security Council Resolution 446 and other United Nations Security Council resolutions, is that all 200 Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian territory are illegal and that they must be removed? And will he also reconfirm that the wall being built by the Israelis, biting deep into Palestinian territory and separating farmers from their land, workers from their jobs, pupils and students from their schools and universities, and sick people from their hospitals, is illegal as well and must also be removed?
Well, our position, of course, remains entirely as we've set it out before, and in respect of the security fence, I say absolutely unequivocally that this must not become part of a political settlement. And that position has been made very clear by myself, by the Foreign Secretary, and by others. I simply repeat again, however, that if such a disengagement from Gaza and parts of the West Bank happens, including, incidentally, the removal of some 7,000 settlers from the Gaza, then it is important the Palestinian Authority is able to step into that breach. That is the only point I'm making. We don't alter our position on the substance of this at all. But the question will ultimately be, as it is with all these types of peace process, as to whether people want to carry on making their statements or whether they want to try to establish a different reality. And that different reality has got to begin with the disengagement being followed by a process of reconstruction.
Sir John Stanley.
The Prime Minister said in his statement that the final settlement in the Middle East can't ignore the reality on the ground. Is it not the case that the reality behind Prime Minister Ron's latest announcement, coupled with the ongoing building of a security wall, is that the Israeli government is bent on what is, in effect, a de facto annexation of significant parts of the West Bank? And as such a policy is both illegal and contrary to the roadmap, why is the Prime Minister going along with it?
I've made it clear that I do not believe the security fence can be used to annex territory. I just want to make one other point, and it is fair that this point is made. Otherwise, we end up, as often in these types of situations, with an entirely one-sided debate. Let us not forget also, even as we condemn the targeted assassinations of Hamas leaders, that Israeli citizens, innocent Israeli citizens, have died in very large number as a result of terrorist acts in Israel, not in the occupied territories, incidentally, in Israel itself. And it is obviously the case that any government, particularly a democratic government, as the one in Israel, is going to want to take measures to protect its citizens. Now, I don't resolve from anything I've said about this, but I think one of the problems in this situation is that people always see one particular point of view. There are two lots of suffering in this case, and both have to be dealt with.
Tom Dale. is not the unpalatable truth that an occupying force, an occupying coalition, is seen more and more as an inspiration, far from curtailing violence, actually inspires violence. And haven't we reached a situation where many Iraqis have come to regard it as a war of liberation? And in those circumstances, there are some of us who think that Mr. Zapatero is right, and embarrassing it may be, and losing face though it may be, that the coalition forces should be withdrawn.
I don't deny for a single instant that the propaganda that has been launched at the coalition is that we are an army of occupation that want to stay there, and stay there irrespective of the wishes of Iraqis in order, some days it's to take their oil, other days it's just to occupy the country. That is the propaganda case that is being made. It happens to be false, as I think most people know and accept. The truth is, neither ourselves nor the United States nor any other country wants to remain a moment longer than is necessary to secure the conditions in which a proper political settlement can take place. And I simply say to my honourable friend, and I understand his very strong views on this subject, but if we were to withdraw coalition troops now and leave Iraq to the mercy of militias, of insurgents, of outside terrorists, then the losers would not just be the whole of the Middle East, the whole of the world actually. The losers most of all would be the Iraqi people themselves. And what is interesting is that if he talks to anyone down in the British sector, for example, in Basra, they will tell him that the vast majority of Iraqis, yes, of course, they don't want an occupation of their country, but they want to make sure that when the occupation leaves, what takes over is the democratic will of the Iraqi people, not the will of extremists and fanatics and those people who would actually take Iraq backwards.
Maples.
In the Middle East peace process, we seem to be moving beyond the roadmap to the implementation of a settlement on the ground. And I would suggest to him that if we continue to pretend that the roadmap has life in it, or that the two parties under their present leaderships are going to negotiate a settlement to all of these issues, what we will end up with is a unilaterally imposed Israeli settlement on the ground. And what we ought to be doing now is to get the Quartet at its meeting in next month, I think it is, to grab control of this issue and attempt to develop a settlement of all the outstanding issues in dialogue with the parties, but not seeking to get them together in direct negotiations, and then seek to impose that settlement. The alternative is not the roadmap, it's a unilaterally imposed Israeli settlement.
I've just got to say to the right honourable gentleman that the Quartet can come to whatever decisions it wishes to come to, but actually I don't think the choice is the one that he poses. I think the only way of getting back into the roadmap, the reason we're not in the roadmap is perfectly simple. The basic security measures that are supposed to be taken under the roadmap haven't yet been taken. Now, all I am saying is that we cannot be in a worse position, surely, than when the disengagement from the Gaza and West Bank happens, we move in on an international basis to develop the security and economic and political infrastructure that the Palestinians need. If we fail to do that, then if there are those in Israel who want de facto, unilaterally, to create a settlement, they will actually gain from the inability of the Palestinians to run their affairs within the territory they will occupy. So that's why it's so important that we seize the opportunity that the disengagement offers us. And I agree with them, of course it's important that the Quartet is fully involved, but the Quartet is not going to be able to negotiate the final status. I think that is unrealistic.
Yeah.
Judge Hurth.
Does my right honourable friend agree with me that although the central role, as he's just described, is between, in terms of relationships between Israel and Palestine, that other states in the region do have a role to play, and will he particularly join in with me in urging Syria to play a constructive and credible part in what can be achieved in that region?
I think the point that my right honourable friend makes is absolutely right, and Syria, I hope, along with other countries, will realise that their support of terrorism and any sponsorship of terrorism is the thing that is preventing us getting back into the roadmap.
Duncan.
The Prime Minister publicly justifies his own actions on the basis of UN resolutions and international law. On what basis does he believe that President Bush is actually entitled to cede Palestinian negotiating positions without their consent? And why does he think that unilaterally sanctioning illegal townships bang in the middle of the West Bank is going to do anything other than destroy any chance of a viable Palestinian state?
President Bush made it clear several times, not just in the press conference with me, but in the press conference with Prime Minister Sharon, that ultimately these issues have to be decided by negotiation. That remains the case. I mean, there are realities in the ground. I think all the discussions that have taken place between the Israelis and the Palestinians throughout many, many peace processes have recognized that. But ultimately these things have to be decided in final status negotiation.
Richard Burden.
Mr. Speaker, is my right honourable friend aware that whilst President Bush was appearing on the White House lawn with Premier Sharon, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance was producing its weekly report on the situation in the occupied territories, which showed further land confiscations, which showed ambulances being turned away from checkpoints, which showed further houses being demolished, and which showed a nursery school in Nablus being closed down when Israeli forces entered it? And given that, does he understand the anger that there is throughout the Arab world and indeed beyond, why Israel felt there was a green light to continue with its illegal policy of targeted assassinations? And if this is going to be an opportunity for the peace process, not a threat, does he agree with me that the Quartet must establish its authority, that the roadmap is not the gift of the US, and that that authority must mean that disengagement must be real, it must be military, as well as the dismantlement of settlements, and that the international community must accept its responsibility for an international presence in that area to ensure that there is peace with justice for both sides in that part of the world?
Let me say to my honourable friend that I agree with them to this extent, that I understand both the anger that there is in the Arab world and the Middle East over these issues. Of course I do. I also believe that it is essential that the Quartet plays a role, and exactly what that role would be in security terms, I think, is something obviously we have to discuss with the Palestinian Authority. But in principle, my view is that the more the international community can be involved in helping and, in a sense, guaranteeing that the Palestinian Authority has the wherewithal to move forward from any unilateral disengagement by the Israelis from the Gaza and parts of the West Bank, the better it is going to be. And that's precisely why I want there to be, I hope in early May, a meeting of the Quartet when we can put aside, as it were, the rights and wrongs of what has happened over the past few days in terms of the statements made either by America or by Israel, or indeed by anyone else, and focus on, if there is this unilateral disengagement, what can the Quartet do to make sure the Palestinian Authority can take advantage of it? Because I think it's just worth pointing out, I think if it hadn't been for these other issues surrounding the announcement by the Israelis, I think much of the Middle East would have welcomed, in principle, a unilateral disengagement from parts of the occupied territory.
Earl Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his statement, the Prime Minister referred to the tragic loss of life of 123 American fatalities, an Ukrainian soldier, US civilians, one British, one Italian, one Canadian, and so on, all tragically killed since mid-March. He made no reference to the number of Iraqis killed. Will he take this opportunity to address that omission? And will he tell the House whether he agrees with the head of the US Army Central Command, who said that these losses, whatever they are the results of a judicious use of force?
I did actually express our sympathy to Iraqi civilians who have died as well. And that's why it is important, frankly, that we make sure that we try and resolve the situation in Fallujah and in Najaf as peacefully as possible, and that's what we're engaged in doing.
Waring.
My right honourable friend, consider advice from me, which is given quite freely, I might say, and that is that he could learn a lot from the experience of the former Soviet Union. It tried to impose its system of government on Eastern European countries, and once they were free from military occupation, they decided to go in a different direction. You cannot impose Western-style democracy on Iraq, which is a country of a different civilization, a much different culture. Once the occupation has ended, Iraq will determine which direction to go and at what pace.
Well, I actually rather think the analogy with what happened with the Soviet Union is a little different from what my honourable friend says. Actually, the moment that they were free from repression, they chose democracy. And I see absolutely no reason why, indeed, I think it is clear that that's what the majority of Iraqis want. This is not, you know, there is an extraordinary attitude in parts of the West that somehow democracy, human rights, the rule of law are somehow Western values. They're actually, in my view, the values of the human spirit, in fact. That is what people want, and that is what people opt for every time they're given the choice. And what we will have in Iraq is a process whereby, first of all, they vote in an assembly to draw up a final constitution for Iraq, and then they have the democratic vote in elections. And I would have thought everybody, no matter what their view on the war in Iraq, would support that.
Yeah. Sir Patrick Carnmike.
In the crucial days leading up to June the 30th, is there not a case for having a British representative of ministerial rank and importance, somebody like Lord Robertson, overseeing what happens from Britain's point of view?
First of all, I can assure the right honourable gentleman that myself and the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary remain, heavily engaged in this issue. I also think that the best way of operating with the CPA, with the coalition authority, the best way of doing that is through the mechanism that we have. And indeed, his leader mentioned earlier Jeremy Greenstock. I know that Jeremy Greenstock's view is that David Richmond is the best person to do that, has the experience, is trusted by the Americans. And I also think it's important to realise this. Of course, everything that happens in any part of Iraq affects all of Iraq. Now, but down in the south, obviously the British forces and the British civilians are in control. In the area around Baghdad, it is American forces and American civilians predominantly that are there. Now, what is important is that we have the right partnership with them where we can influence decisions that are being taken. I genuinely believe that is the case now. Of course, you always keep it under review, but he has done a very, very good job. Jeremy Greenstock first and then David Richmond. And, if people from inside Iraq, either members of the governing council or other people who we have there, or the military, the British military in Iraq, were saying to us, look, this isn't the right way of working, of course we would listen very carefully, but they're not, I have to say. And there are certain issues that have to be resolved actually at a government-to-government level as well.
The co-file.
Once more, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister seems to make a cogent case for matters pertaining to the Middle East, but isn't the truth at the moment that the June the 30th deadline, the latter-day conversion to the United Nations, and the U-turn on the fundamental human rights of Palestinians, more to do with the re-election of the President than the longer-term stability of that worried part of the world? And isn't it also the case that Sharon will continue to assassinate with impunity because there's nothing that anybody can or will do about it, and that post-June the 30th, heavy-handed American military activity will determine the future of Iraq, certainly not the United Nations?
The United Nations will have a key and central role, obviously, in the political transition. I mean, I simply say to my honourable friend, it is difficult when American troops are suffering losses and when they're coming under attack from terrorists or insurgents. They have a difficult position to maintain there. In respect of the Middle East peace process, I return to the point that I've made constantly. People can argue about what the President said, what the Prime Minister of Israel said. They can argue about their motivations. That is an argument, in a sense, that really doesn't profit anybody, because ultimately the question is, what can we do about this situation? And the sole point I return to is that if the one big reality on the ground changes, namely with the withdrawal by Israel from the whole of the Gaza and parts of the West Bank, that is something not to be looked in the mouth, but actually to be built upon.
Desmond Swain.
Mr. Speaker, given that 3 UK Armoured Division and the Civilian Provisional Authority conducted successful local government elections in southern Iraq on a household franchise based on the ration card system last August and September, doesn't the Prime Minister agree that the best way to undermine the likes of Muttaq al-Sadr and show how few people they do represent is to move swiftly to national elections in Iraq?
First of all, let me again thank the Honourable Gentleman for his service and the commitment that he showed in Iraq. Secondly, I agree entirely. That's absolutely right. And what it shows is that people are perfectly prepared to participate in those elections and want to do so. And what they are doing at the moment, what is happening in Iraq, is we are being put to the test because some of these groups wonder whether we have the commitment to see it through. That's what they wonder. And a lot of people in Iraq, I mean, they haven't had democracy. They've had a brutal repression for over 3 decades. And they will be asking themselves, are things really going to change or not? And we've got to give them the confidence that they are going to.
Ms. Ellman.
I thank the Prime Minister for his tireless work in trying to bring peace and justice to both Palestinians and Israelis. Does he agree that the withdrawal of around 7,000 Israeli settlers from Gaza should be a cause for celebration, not for grudging acceptance? And what does he believe that this government can do to ensure that we now move forward to negotiations based on the roadmap and the Geneva Protocols put together by progressive Israelis and Palestinians and based on the important principle of land for peace?
Well, I agree with what my honourable friend says, and I think it's just worth pointing out for a moment that had the Palestinians come forward several months ago and made the demand that 7,000 settlers be moved from the Gaza, that Israel disengage unilaterally from the Gaza and parts of the West Bank, people would have thought that was quite a bold negotiating ploy. And what I really think has happened is the surrounding issues to do with what was said about final status questions like right of return and so on has obscured the fact that underneath all that, there is actually something that we can work with.
Dr. Gillian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If, God forbid, Al-Qaeda succeeded in killing as many civilians in the United Kingdom as Hamas has succeeded in killing in Israel, would the Prime Minister rule out a policy of targeted assassination of Osama bin Laden?
I think it is important all the way through that we act in accordance with international law, and that's what we should do. And we've made our position clear on the targeted assassinations. But I did say in my statement, and I do repeat, we of course condemn the terrorist atrocities committed by Hamas.
Wenda Jackson.
Speaker, does the military and political strategy we have, to which the Prime Minister referred, mean that the British government supported the level and type of action visited upon Fallujah and Najaf, in which by far the greatest loss of life were innocent Iraqi civilians? And does this mean that such actions will be endorsed by the British government should they become necessary in the future?
I think it is worth looking at what is happening now. What is happening now is that we are trying peacefully to resolve the situation in Fallujah. It is a difficult situation when 4 contractors are taken out and brutally murdered in the way that they are. And there was bound to be a reaction to it. However, I hope that we can resolve the issue in Fallujah in a peaceful way, and that's what we're trying to do.
Jonathan Seed.
Has one of the effects of the war in Iraq and also the lack of a coherent exit strategy been to increase the terrorist threat, not just in Iraq, but also here in the UK?
First of all, there is a perfectly coherent exit strategy. It is to make sure that the Iraqi people can enjoy the same freedom that we enjoy. And there's no reason why they shouldn't. There's no reason why they shouldn't if they support the new constitution, and they're allowed to support the new constitution by people who are attacking them. And I think it is important that we maintain that situation. As for being a terrorist target, I mean, I honestly think the honourable gentleman does a disservice to us all when he suggests that these people in Al-Qaeda and these other terrorists, somehow if Iraq didn't exist, would be silent. Right? These are the people that want us to withdraw from Afghanistan. Right? They want us, well, I don't know what, he says it might increase the threat. I don't know what could be a bigger threat than that represented by September the 11th, which, let me remind him, was done before we were in Iraq or Afghanistan. The truth is, if we withdrew from Iraq, they tell us to withdraw from Afghanistan. If we withdraw from Afghanistan, we have to withdraw from the whole of the Middle East. And if we do that, they will make us do even more. Well, it was actually. It was saying, haven't we made ourselves a bigger target by our action in Iraq? And my answer to that is, we are a target for these people by the very existence and values that we believe in. And the only way we're going to defeat them is to get after them.
John Ruddock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A month ago, I was in Gaza myself with Christian Aid, and I saw the humanitarian and indeed economic and political crisis that existed there. While I understand why my right honourable friend has welcomed the withdrawal, which I would also from the settlements, does he accept that timing is everything? If indeed Israel continued to bulldoze the lands in the perimeter areas, to have a complete crackdown and no freedom of movement for Palestinians, there would be no peace and very little hope. It is essential that when he speaks of the quartet, that President Bush is supporting that move and that the international community is in there immediately, because there is no viable Palestinian state simply made by withdrawal from settlements.
I think that my honourable friend is right in saying that we obviously must make sure that there is not a further entirely unjustified reality on the ground created. But I say to her that one of the key things in preventing that is to get a proper security plan in place on the Palestinian side. Because whilst the terrorist attacks occur within Israel, there will be retaliation. I mean, that is the fact. I mean, that, and then the cycle of terrorism and retaliation becomes worse. That's why it's important that we act as an international community.
Edward Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his statement, the Prime Minister said that the United Nations should have a central role and will have a vital role post the 30th of June this year. But the United Nations has no armed forces nor external civil service except those volunteered by the member states. Beyond the existing members of the coalition, what other countries have volunteered assistance?
Well, there are around about, I think, 30 countries in the coalition, and whether we can draw more people in or not, I think depends in part on how we improve the security situation now. But the United Nations, the role of the United Nations is not and never was intended to be that they would actually do the security themselves. The United Nations would not want to do that. The United Nations role is to make sure that the international community is underscoring the legitimacy of what is happening, meaning, for example, that in certain things like the oil wealth, the United Nations makes sure through its various organisations that it can be a signatory to the account in order to ensure that we actually have the Iraqi oil money used for the Iraqis and seen as such. Now, I think that's the role the United Nations can play, and they're particularly important, obviously, in the details of the political transition.
Peter Pake.
Might all condemn what originally happened in Fallujah. Will my honourable friend not recognise that many of us condemn what has happened there and the number of Iraqi civilians that have died? It cannot be condoned, it cannot be acceptable. And will he also recognise that many of us, despite viewing the fact that he is 100% committed to the roadmap, we do not believe that President Bush and Sharon have the same objective as he has as to where the destination of that roadmap is?
I only say on the latter point that President Bush restated his commitment several times. I just do say that the reason why the roadmap is not moving forward at this point in time is because of the problems of security. And that's why it's important that we deal with that. There's no other way of getting back into the roadmap.
John Redwood.
Speaker, I warmly welcome the Prime Minister's enthusiasm for democracy in Iraq and now at home on the issue of Europe. It's great news. Could he tell us how long he thinks British troops will need to stay in Iraq to supervise the transition and whether we will need to reinforce?
In respect of the length of stay of British troops, no, we can't be sure at this point in time. Obviously, what it depends on is making sure the security situation is sorted out. But I think we will be in a far... it is not coincidental that this violence is happening in the run-up to the 30th of June. I mean, the purpose of it is to stop us making progress on the 30th of June, because if they think they can do that, then their propaganda that actually we don't want to give them democracy gets off the ground. I mean, that's what it's all about, and that's why we've got to hold firm. So perhaps post 30th of June I'll be in a better position to say.
Osman.
Everybody in this House will condemn the barbaric killing of the 4 contractors in Fallujah, but independent sources estimate about 700 civilians have been killed in Fallujah, thousands injured, including the deaths of 80 children. Does the Prime Minister condemn this disproportionate use of force by the United States against the citizens of Fallujah? And is he willing to support an independent UN inquiry into just what went off, or will we see even more Fallujahs as this violence escalates?
I hope very much that we don't, and that is what I am working for now. And I hope we can see a peaceful resolution of it.
Order.